Hey, John Gilroy here. Today, we're going to dive into AI-powered supply chain management. Hit the music, Manny. Welcome to the Federal Tech Podcast, the podcast that connects you to federal technology leaders. In the virtual studio today is Bob Kolasky, Senior Vice President for Critical Infrastructure at Exiger, E-X-I-G-E-R. Bob, how are you?
Great, John. I'm thrilled to be with you.
I've done a bunch of interviews, and I always interested in company names and how they got started. Oh, my mom and I were at the kitchen table, and we started something. So there are people that maybe have heard of Exiger, some don't. Give us the origin story here. I mean, it's an unusual name. I just don't know where it started.
Sure, John. I'll skip the origin story for the name of Exiger, but let me tell you the story about the company. We are 13 or so years old now. Predates me being there. I've been with the company for 4 years. But it's a really neat story. The founders, the company, Mike Cherkasky, Mike Bieber, got the company going on the back of doing the monitorship for HSBC Bank. So the Department of Justice, both of them had a background in DOJ and in doing auditing and fraud monitoring and the like. And the HSBC was being investigated and then ultimately was charged with not knowing their customers, not knowing where the money would go in terrorist funding, drug funding related things. And so DOJ put them under a monitorship. The bank, we still believe it's the largest monitorship that the DOJ ever put in place. And Exiger formed as a company to oversee the Know Your Customer process build for HSBC and to work on behalf of the U.S. government to make sure that the bank was putting in place the mitigation processes that they had agreed to as part of the agreement. And so, what we did as a company is we hired a bunch of people who had backgrounds in auditing, investigation, fraud monitoring, setting up processes and programs to build out and understand and know your customer. And at some point, we also invested in the technology to go deeper, to do due diligence on who you were doing business with.
That's the start.
And we started to both build and buy technologies to do good due diligence. As the monitorship came to an end and as we were spinning out the company from that primary work, we had a bunch of people who were using technologies to do good, deep due diligence around third parties, customers, and ultimately suppliers. And at some point around the time I got there, 2021, 2022, not that it was all about me or anything, but we pivoted to recognize that it was the technology that was the real business. And we had for our own purposes built really effective tools to go deep, what we would now say that we've augmented with artificial intelligence and machine learning and natural language processing to do monitoring of deep due diligence, third parties, fourth parties, supply chains. And so, we pivoted to become a technology company because we had built really great technology. That's where the market took us. We got into the federal space around 2019, 2020. Of course, that aligns with COVID, which was one of the biggest supply chain crises the globe has known. And certainly the federal government, I was in the federal government at that time, working for the Department of Homeland Security, and Exiger's technology was being deployed widely to illuminate supply chains to understand where there were potential access to personal protective equipment, medical countermeasures that were necessary during the pandemic. And as the government started to spend money to ask for additional suppliers to bring that stuff in, so we had access to more stuff to take care of people. We turned our technology to evaluate the companies that were offering PPE and medical countermeasures to the government. And we detected all this companies that popped up fraudulently to try to sell counterfeit goods or didn't have the ability to deliver what they were promising to the government. And we helped save DOD and the government a bunch of money for not buying stuff that ultimately wouldn't have been effective or delivered. And from there, we've just built out our federal supply chain business.
Yeah. I'm an old man. I'll give you an old man summary from 1971. There's a rock and roll album released called "Who Are You?"
Yes.
so you, hey, what can you do, Bob?
And I bet I can guess the band, right?
Yeah, I can. Yes. I can identify who the vendor is, who this company is, who this person is, and so that's a nice summary. And the reason you're on the show is because back in COVID, I went to a wedding in L.A. and I went to Long Beach and I saw these ships stacked and there's these containers way out in the middle of nowhere. I'm figuring, Bob Kowalski's sitting somewhere waiting for his shoes to come in, or maybe there's a federal agency waiting for a router to come in or for a piece of equipment to come in. So And I think that, I'll tell you, I think I saw at a trade show 3 or 4 months ago, your company, and people are getting their eye off the ball. And what happens is you get fat and sassy, put your feet up, you smoke a cigar, and then you get hit with supply chain again. But I think this is a kind of a remedial interview. We're saying, hey, this is still there. This is still a problem. And I think in the situation we're at in the United States now, it's even more critical a problem to understand where we're getting these things from.
We're certainly, we are right now in a conflict between the U.S. and Israel and Iran about. Ultimately, there are a lot of different issues, but the thing that we're trying to get resolved is getting a supply chain back up and running, right? And so the Strait of Hormuz is a key choke point in a supply chain. And, I hope that as that gets resolved, that gets resolved relatively quickly in whatever way it does. And we won't talk about the pros and cons of the war right now, but either way, companies need to know what exposure they have to things that they're counting on that are flowing from the Strait of Hormuz or might be choked off because of something else that's going on in that region right now. Top of headlines are things like fertilizer, where so much fertilizer is produced from the Middle East and in regions over there. And so there's going to be shortages, right? There's going to be energy shortages. There's going to be changing prices. There's going to be fertilizer shortages. There are going to be all kinds of derivative products like that. And if you're managing a company that has a global supply chain, you better understand what your exposure is. And it is tools like we bring to the market. Exiger can help you understand your exposure.
Let's go from fertilizer to humans.
Yeah.
You and I both been in situations where someone get a little checklist and a piece of paper and say, okay, okay, you can go home now. I've seen that in big companies. I've seen that in federal agencies. And so how can you get a federal leader to make a transition from, this paper-based solution where, it's a policy checklist to actually, moving away from these policy memos into action and calling you guys up or looking at the supply chain? Does there have to be an incident, or is it people are just going to be mandated are there mandates for supply chain? I don't even know.
Yeah. So let's start. I think there are 3 federal use cases maybe we can talk about, and I'll let you tell me which ones you want to talk about. One is acquisitions. One is cyber or software supply chains, and one is operations or managing your own supply chains, like I was just talking about COVID. And if you're the Department of Veterans Affairs or the Army, you're buying a bunch of stuff. So
yeah, my listeners want the software supply chain, man. Let's jump in the software.
Okay, so let's go software. So are there mandates there are mandates out there right now, as you know, that flow from previous executive orders and OMB documents that you need to know what critical software you are acquiring, and you need to have a critical software list. And so if you are a federal CISO, federal CIO in the acquisition shops, you certainly know, hopefully at this point, which critical software you're buying and putting on your systems. Some mandates exist, but we would advise that with those critical softwares, whether there's a mandate or not, get the software bill of materials for critical software and track and monitor and collect via your contract, make contractual requirements. In some places in the Army, those requirements exist that they have to happen. Medical devices are statutorily required to provide SBOMs, but collect those SBOMs. But then what Exiger lets you do, and what companies like us let you do, is get some value out of those SBOMs. And so while the software bills of materials have the component parts that are in your software, the software chains, you actually have to evaluate the risks of the software that you're introducing through the software bills of material. And through our Exiger cyber capability, we help people both create SBOMs, but then use SBOMs to see where there's risk factors in the software.
See where there's risk factors. Earlier, you talked about illumination, which is kind of a fun word to say on the podcast here. So what's this illumination stuff, and what does that mean for the real people who have to worry about this stuff? So supply chain illumination, what does that mean?
That's visibility, right? It is visibility of going down, continuing the software path. It is visibility about chains of code, open source sources of code that are in your software supply chain. And by creating that visibility, by illuminating it, you can evaluate against the kind of risk factors that we're talking about. You can see when a new known exploitable vulnerability is introduced by CISA, where I used to work. You can see whether any of your software might have known exploitable vulnerabilities in there. You can match it against the CVE database that's maintained by the U.S. government. But you can also see factors like how often is the open source code maintained? How many committers are there? Are there any connections with potentially foreign adversarial nations and there. And so you're evaluating the risk. So the illumination gives you the visibility across things. And that's a digital illumination I'm talking about, but we can also talk about physical illuminations about how finished goods actually are put together, where the component pieces are shipped from, what minerals and materials and chemicals go into those finished goods. And by creating the more visibility, by illuminating things like that, you can see where there are risk factors.
Yeah. I have a friend who started a company in Ohio. It was like overnight. And in America, the good news is you can start an LLC during this interview. The bad news is you can start an LLC. So there's a lot of shell companies, a lot of deception can be taking place. And so if we just look at, John Gilroy Software owned by 3 or 4 different LLCs, and all of a sudden it shows up in a bid to supply the government, is there a way to filter through that? Do you need to have Sherlock Holmes, or how do you know?
Let me give you an example. Let's think about John Gilroy Software is looking for federal funds through the SBIR program for the Small Business Innovation Research Program. And so you actually submit an application for that. Say you demonstrate that you think you qualify, or that you're telling the government that you qualify. The SBIR programs better be looking at what risk factors exist with John Gilroy factors. I'm going to assume that you've got a fairly broad social media and web presence. So, we are able to scrape and see things that happen that you've done on the web in the past, but we're also able to look at the founder of the organization. Are there any risk factors associated with the founders of the organization? What financial records are available? Have there been any fines, sanctions of anything like that? Do you have any ties to foreign adversarial governments? Those sorts of things should be looked at. And I won't pick on John Gilroy Enterprise anymore, but for small businesses, make sure that they are actually run by people who are reputable, have financial records. And so we don't want these federal assistance programs to be backdoors for countries to fund and get access, adversarial countries get access to intellectual property or get federal funding to do something that's not working in America's national interest.
Yeah, small is the S&S burst. So, it's small, and it could be a small company like John Gilroy Software. So I apply to agency A and they vet me and they go, okay, this guy's good. Now, is that a set it and forget it, or I could change overnight? I guess I could lose a lot of money gambling.
And I want to be, we're having fun with the example, but I'll be a little more explicit. Yes, we can look at the very small companies, but really the risk lies in things that are a little bit bigger there, and things that somebody's actually put in some work to go after the funding, but maybe is trying to hide factors that present some risks, or maybe there's things that are unseen there. And it certainly isn't a one and done thing. Our system, and this goes into the AI and technological aspects of it, our systems will do an initial screening for the point of a go, no-go decision on federal funding, but then we will continuously monitor and push information to our customers about anything that has changed about a third party or supplier that you're doing business with. And there are some things, as you said, you might get bought, a company might get bought, it might get a merger activity, it might get fined in one state. There may be some negative press related to that. And there are things like that you want to know, so that, again, a lot of this, we're talking to a federal audience, and we do a lot of work for funding agencies within the federal government. They want to effectively manage the federal dollar to make sure there's no potential for fraud behind it, and there's no reputational hit. And then we're not giving money inadvertently to businesses that are working on behalf of the Chinese or Russian governments.
Yeah. So when it comes to vetting, what's the biggest blind spots that people don't see or miss?
In terms of vetting, I think, the blind spots, again, there are lots of companies that have complex financial arrangements where the owners aren't clear. There are multiple operating locations, slightly different names. They're doing businesses in multiple languages. And so a lot of it is unpacking. And this is, again, where I think AI technology helps, is unpacking the complexity of the ownership things, so that you can, we can translate across 90 plus languages, so we can review things that are happening in different countries there. So we can review all kinds of different filings. We can build relationship maps of who's involved, who the ultimate beneficial owners are. And part of it goes down to we're actually trying, and this goes back to our history, we're trying to illuminate things where companies are obfuscating, intentionally trying to hide things from their customers or the government or things like that. And so if they're trying to do things, you need technology to try to undermine them.
Yeah. I like the word illumination. Let's talk about illumination now. I got good news and bad news. The good news is illuminated. The bad news is there is a lot of stuff that can come under a flashlight when you're looking for something in the backyard. I mean, from your situation, John Gilroy Software, you got to look at structured, unstructured data. You got to look at maybe adverse media, social media. You got to look at ownership records, trade data. And so how do you get enough for a human to make a decision on? I mean, you could probably spend a week on a company. I mean, so at what point in time do you say, okay, I think we have enough money that we're not going to drive a human crazy? Maybe automation, maybe AI can help filter this. Is that what the filter is?
Yeah, so a couple of different things. One, the things that it would have taken us a week to spend to do the kinds of illuminations you're just talking about. We built the data sets and the technologies, and we 5x, 10x our ability to do those illuminations. And one of the things we're proud of is we give an illumination of risk in a supply chain such that somebody can take formal action. So we're documenting why something looks like it's a risk. Let me give you a federal use case that corporate America certainly cares about: forced labor, the Uyghur Forced Labor Protection Act. And so, companies are required to know what's in their supply chain and attest if they're buying from certain parts of the world that they don't have Uyghur forced labor in their supply chain. And we can both help the government, in this case, parts of Customs and Border Protection. We can help them understand where there may be forced labor in supply chains, and we can help them work with the shippers and the suppliers to demonstrate that there isn't. And that stuff is sped up so quickly. And to your point of how it gets used, we give these packages of information to customers and point to risk factors, and then they can go down the path and look at the actual individual piece of information and evaluate whether to take an audit decision, a stop shipment decision, or any sort of no-go decision. And the documentation's all there. We're quickly working toward both help our customers do that, but then also help our customers understand other ways that they can manage risk given their authorities and their responsibilities, and build out some of the agentic AI capabilities to more effectively take action as soon as risk is surfaced.
I go to a lot of trade shows. I had a trade show a couple weeks back, and sitting at a table, it had a couple of govies there. One was working for an agency. I had a chat with this individual. And the speaker was talking about AI, and he said, we're not even allowed to touch it. We can't look at it. We can't do anything like that because we have to have it completely transparent and defensible. Mm-hmm. And so when someone looks up to you and says, well, I know you're using AI to look at my supply chain, but is there a way that you can make it transparent and show what you're looking for and not looking for? Is that part of the offering?
Yeah, no, it goes back to the diligence again. This is why I like the Department of Justice origin story, because we were doing formal monitoring to give evidence, right? It was evidence-based monitoring. So we are using AI, but we're using AI to surface evidence that ultimately people can take action against. Yeah. And so, of course, we can spit out, like, here's some things to be concerned about in a narrative form. And we do things like quantify risk and say, this looks like it's probably high risk. It's a 7 out of a 10-point scale in our scale and all that. But that's not what you need to take official action. You need the evidence that goes into the narrative and the risk score. And so we point to the actual sources of evidence that then can be taken action against. And you can pull them. We are a system of record. You can pull those systems. And we've been used in many different legal settings where people are using our information to justify decisions that they took because they have access to primary source information that provides the evidence you need to take an enforcement action.
Yeah. If a Progressive Insurance Company in Ohio hired you guys to look at their supply chain versus a federal agency, so what different types of validation would a commercial company ask for, or what more or different would the federal agency ask for from your company about?
Sure. So our business is about 50-50 federal and non-federal. A big source of our non-federal business is the defense industrial base. And the defense industrial base is demonstrating to their prime contractor, and the prime contractors for the Department of Defense, Department of War, are demonstrating that they've got visibility into their supply chain and they're looking at risk. So one answer to the commercial question is commercial companies use Exiger because the government trusts Exiger, and the government is setting the expectation that supply chain risks are being looked at, and lots of the government uses Exiger to do that, and private companies are like, well, if it's good enough for the government, it's good enough for us. More broadly, to your Progressive Insurance or any other sort of large-scale Fortune 500 or multinational company, they're managing risk against a range of different things that they need to do to keep their supply chains going. Some is operational risk. Is a port going to shut down somewhere? What if a port shuts down somewhere? What if shipping isn't going through the Strait of Hormuz? What kind of supplies are we exposed to not having? Others are companies are subject to multiple regulations. I give a presentation that there are something like 58 lists that governments have put on of banned products. And some companies are subject to, they've got to follow like 25 lists of banned products. And so how can you do that without technology? How can you not do that without somebody maintaining those lists? And a lot of those lists are subsidiary and affiliate lists too. So it's not only that Huawei is banned from federal contractors buying Huawei parts, but so are Huawei subsidiaries and affiliates, and we need to track that.
Yeah, the LLC that's within a different shape. Yeah, overseas comebacks, and it gets to be so difficult.
So the NDAA had 5 companies in Section 889 of like 2019 NDAA authorization, right? And Huawei, ZTE, Hikvision, Dahua, et cetera. But we put together a list of over 1,000 subsidiary and affiliates that are associated with those things. And the letter of the law is federal contractors can't buy from those 1,000 companies, not just those 5 companies. And if you think about the Chinese government maybe trying to influence technology that the federal government buys for purposes of espionage and all that, you need to stay on top of that constantly shifting threat.
I was just thinking, Bob, so you hire me to figure these 1,000 companies out, and I walk into the office with a big whiteboard. Run out of space pretty fast with 1,000 companies, different arrows. Yeah. I'm going to have to use ribbons and pin. I mean, it's just, it's got to be and it's intentional obfuscation.
Yeah. But what you're describing was 2018-19. What we're describing now is
today,
AI, right?
Yeah.
And this is continuously being monitored and managed and all that. And you're getting the notice. And not only are you getting the notice, you're seeing, the FCC took activity against routers. And routers that were not manufactured in the U.S. a couple weeks ago. We're still trying to figure out what exactly that means from a restriction list. But if there's certain routers that are now banned because of the FCC activity, and you're one of the prime contractors and you're buying routers, you need to know the alternatives. And so not only are we pointing out, where you may have sources of banned items, or your suppliers may have sources of banned items, but we're also helping you identify alternatives and maybe ultimately find, what those alternatives sell for. And could you enter into a contract with an alternative and set some price certainty and things like that? So it's a money saver.
Right. It's the ROI. It's like, okay, I could have 3 of my staff get a whiteboard that's a mile and connect all the dots. And in a year, but there's efficiencies that can be had through companies like yours who've been there, done that, most of the names, can present it carefully and logically. And it just is if ever talk about efficiency and ROI, this is a real quick win, I think, as far as just making sure that it's safe.
Yeah. And safe is part of this, going back to Fed acquisitions have always been about cost, performance, and schedule. They should also be cost, performance, schedule, and security. And we would say that we can help acquisition professionals make better decisions about whether companies are going to live up to the cost, performance, and schedule and security requirements they have to do business with the Fed. And we can monitor that if things are changing.
Yeah. Exiger. I got one final question. You casually mentioned the DIB, Defense Industrial Base. Some people say there's 300,000 companies in the DIB. There's a lot, and they're really worried about CMMC, and they're worried about other things. So from your perspective, you've got this, catbird seat. You've seen a lot of different things over the years here. So what mistakes do you see these federal contractors, the DIB, repeatedly making?
So, it all comes into, it's not going to surprise you. Gain the visibility of where you're buying your critical products from and do some forward planning against whether that's all going to be available so you can deliver against schedule. And, part of the visibility is who you're buying from. Do they have the right cybersecurity practices in? And we're talking about CMMC. Have they been CMMC certified, or are they likely to be successful at being CMMC certified? And you can look at factors like that. Yeah. But a lot of the mistakes are people rushing into doing things without actually checking and gaining visibility and doing some forward planning about things that could go wrong there. And so, I'm a risk management guy at my core. Exiger is a risk management company, my core. And so, think about and manage risks from the outset and not just, get layer on risks that you have to deal with later in the process.
I'm not going to name any companies, but I would imagine theoretically there are federal contractors out there that may put a bid on a certain system and make claims that aren't 100% true.
Yep.
and may get the contract and then start scurrying around saying, I'm supposed to have a 3/8-inch drill here and I got to, and then all of a sudden they got to call Bob up and go, well, I don't know. I told him that. That's never happened, but it happens.
If you engage with Exiger at the beginning, you're less likely to make claims that are not true, and the buyer is going to know that the company that they're looking at is more and more likely to be just making true statements.
Yeah, and that happens all over the place. This is a wonderful interview. And this interview started when I was on a boat in Long Beach looking at those ships out there and the whole supply chain. And I think people are taking their eye off the ball here. But then that's when you get punched, is when you drop your hands and bang, you get hit. So you really have to. Yeah. This is not a one and done. This is like, okay, the first of the month, let's start it again and continuously monitor this because it's going to flex and move and change.
I mean, we use a statistic that I don't remember exactly, but a big car company, what it takes to build a car is 90% in the supply chain, right? And you can imagine the same thing in a weapon system. And so when you're talking about supply chain, you're talking about almost the whole thing, right? And so, and lots of things can cause supply chains to break.
Good. Exiger.com, any kind of a white paper there or any place you want to direct the listeners to visit that site?
No, I think we've got a good site and we're continuously upgrading it. So, I think hopefully it's something listeners check out often and they'll see lots there. We've got a couple free offerings, including a free forced labor .ai offering where people can just take a look at kind of where there might be forced labor in some of the suppliers they're looking at and get a taste of what Exiger can deliver. Well, my kids sure would be the first one on that one. I think that topic may have come up over Easter. It's a human being thing, so that's good. So what I'll do is I'll put a link in the show notes to Exiger, and I'm glad we kind of started the fire back up again to talk about supply chain management, because I think you're doing so many things and all of a sudden you leave your eye off the ball, something happens and then something comes into the system. It's so easy with software, especially with advances in artificial intelligence, masquerading things or deceiving. And it's just going to be a fascinating world in the next 5 years, people using all this software off the shelf, then modifying with AI, and then having to certify it. Boy, it's so complex. Yeah.
Good. Oh, great.
We need technology to stay ahead of technology, right?
Yeah. You have been listening to the Federal Tech Podcast with John Gilroy. I'd like to thank my guest, Bob Kolasky, Senior Vice President for Critical Infrastructure at Exiger, EXIGER.